So I'm in the cellars at Schug Estate with Walter Schug. Walter, thank you for taking the time to meet with us.
Pleasure to have you here.
So you have a long history here. Could you give us a little bit of your background? Because I know that a lot of people out there may not be familiar with your personal story.
That may be so, yes. Both my wife and I were born and raised in wine estates in Germany that our fathers managed. So we bring a lot of wisdom along with that, and it helped us do what we're doing. When I arrived in California, I came over as a professional because of prohibition. The young generation had not taken up training to make wine in America, and so there was a dire need for trained winemakers. And that goes back to 1959. It was pretty interesting winemaking that I found when I got here, because at that time most of it was made in bulk wine form, shipped back east to be bottled there by distributors who slapped their own label on it. And there was no identification to origin of the wine. Grape variety was not mentioned. It was just, if it was red, it was blended. If it was white, it was blended. And furthermore, depending on the ethnicity of the market that was supplied, back then you still had very pronounced German sectors, French sectors in the cities, and the distributors would call the white wine a Rhine if it was the German sector, and if it was the French sector, it became a Chablis Blanc. So a little bit hilarious, but that's the way it was.
Right.
To then tell the consumers that varietal wines, identifiable varietal wines, are superior, more interesting, took for quite a while.
I can imagine.
And there were a few of us immigrant guys, Andrei Chelachev and Napa and so forth, who were working hard on that. The other thing that I found was that the grape varieties we were interested in did not exist, because most of the grapes during Prohibition that were planted by growers were so-called shippable grapes. In other words, grapes that would take the voyage to New York or Chicago to be sold as grapes to people who wanted to make a little wine in the bathtub.
Mm-hmm. So thick skins, tough grapes.
Yes. So some of the more interesting grape varieties were not planted for that reason, and so if you wanted to make a Pinot Noir, for instance, there wasn't any in existence.
So when you came here, you came to Sonoma or to Napa?
No, I came to California in '61. And so yes, there was all the Central Valley plantings, which were huge, but as I said, they had a different purpose. And there were also more superior plantings in Northern California, but the assortment just wasn't right. You couldn't find Cabernet Sauvignon or some of these things, or Pinot Noir. Yeah, Zinfandel was there.
Sure.
Yeah. And So as I was given duties to do certain things, like what brought me to Northern California was the Gallo organization, who was buying 20,000 tons of fruit in Northern California because they know they needed that extra quality to lift themselves above their competition. And even though those grapes cost a lot more than in the Central Valley, they did the right thing. So I was representing Gallo up here in entire Northern California. It gave me immense information as to what was going on, what was growing where.
You were buying fruit for them?
Yes, and supervising their production into wine. The Gallo organization had several wineries under contract where those grapes would be sent to, made into wine, shipped to Gallo when Gallo needed them. Most of them were cooperatives. There was the Calistoga Co-op, the Napa Valley Co-op, the St. Helena Co-op.
All gone now.
They're all gone, yes. Guild Ukiah Growers Co-op. That was my northernmost territory. I put in a lot of mileage.
I can imagine. On roads that probably weren't that good. Yeah.
And I had about 500 growers whose grapes were being bought, processed by these wineries, and so forth. It was very interesting, very interesting. And so as the opportunity arose that I could make some high quality wine, I met a Mr. Phelps, Hensel Phelps Construction Company, who was building a winery, which is now called Rutherford Hill Winery, for a customer. And as that was being constructed, Mr. Phelps indicated that he'd actually be interested in having his own winery too. So he asked the future winemaker of that winery under construction who we should talk to. So it was a friend of mine. He said, "Why don't you talk to Walter Schug? Maybe he'll do it." So had Mr. Phelps, a great businessman. He laid out the program for me. He said, "This is what I want us to do, and I'll give you the freedom to do that." And it was an immense opportunity.
Yeah, certainly.
Yes. And the other interesting thing was then to get the public more interested in sophisticated wines. And amongst them, the so-called varietal wines, wines named after their variety. Hopefully the variety represented itself as a good variety, because quite often maybe it may have been planted in the wrong place. Wrong soils, wrong territory.
Not unusual even 10 years ago.
Right. So, for instance, the Napa Valley floor Pinot Noir, you could forget. It wasn't very good. But yet, you could get Napa Valley Pinot Noir if you came out of the Carneros region. Or the one that I dealt with was a fantastic wine which came from Napa Valley, but it was on top of the mountain. And at 4 o'clock it was already in the shade. Therefore, it did not take the high sun, which would have ruined it, and convinced me that yes, indeed, Pinot Noir can be made, in spite of all the so-called wine writers, coming and saying, "Yeah, we're showing France a thing or two now about the Bordeaux style and so forth, but we'll never be able to make a good Pinot Noir. We don't have Burgundy soils." Well, I knew that was baloney, because I was born and raised on a Pinot estate in Germany, which was one of the most famous Pinot estates in the world, which my father managed from 1923 to 59. And guess what? It was all slate soil. It was not Burgundian soil. So So these kind of comments, they make me smile.
Sure.
But that also encouraged me to stick with it, because the goal at Phelps was we're going to make the finest Cabernet, some of which later became insignia. We were making the finest Chardonnay, and we had to take some of these odd, quote-unquote, varieties from growers whose Cabernet we wanted. And they said, if you want our Cabernet, you've got to take everything else I got too.
So what sort of things were they?
Well, amongst them was Pinot Noir.
Which you were happy to take?
There were all kinds of other things, but it wasn't part of the winemaking plan at Phelps. I knew how to deal with it, and so we made Sauvignon Blanc, we even made Riesling. As a matter of fact, the German Rhine Wine Convent made me an honorary member for my success with Riesling outside of Germany.
Fantastic.
And that gave me the strength to go against the press, for instance. Because at Phelps, it didn't make any difference how good the Pinot Noir was. We couldn't sell it. The consumer was blinded by the press.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually the decision was made that we're going to take Pinot Noir out of the program. I loved Pinot Noir because I was born and raised with it, and I asked Mr. Phelps to give me the opportunity to continue to make it under my own name. I would reimburse the costs at the winery. And he was generous enough, and he said, yes, you can do that.
So you started making Pinot Noir out of Napa Valley fruit?
Yes, the Carneros.
Okay.
And that mountain vineyard I was talking about, which was high above the Bale Mill in Napa Valley. And of course, again, I didn't have much more success in selling it in America than Joseph Phelps Winery. But I started shipping it to Germany.
Oh, wow.
Because Germany was buying a lot of red wine from France.
So what year was this?
Well, that was the end of the 70s, and it was in the 80s, yes. So December 83 was my last presence at Phelps. After that, I was independent. So because Germany was mostly oriented to white grapes, they were buying all their Pinot Noir and things like that in France. So there was an opportunity to sell our wine. And that kept us in business, kept us from going bankrupt. And from there we went forward.
It's a rather unique solution, a very thinking outside of the box
Sure,
way of business.
Yes.